In the absence of anyone else, Mr Chairman, three issues on the REM report, and I would be interested in seeing the proxies to get a gauge whether any of these issues have been treated with such concern by your institutional investors that they've voted against. The first one is the circumstances of the termination payment, and that's what you've described it as, a termination payment of, I think it was $2.7 million to Mr John Stewart. Now, in reading all the press, I thought that he was just retiring. That he was a good guy, he did a good job, it was terrific. He came out from the UK to help us out. His first contract actually had provided in there that he had a one-way flight home after 3 years. That's what it actually said in the contract, one-way flights. That was a short-term deal. We did a contract extension because it was going so well. We persuaded him to stay for a bit longer. Great job. And then happy retirement, nice farewell dinners, all very convivial and friendly. And then I read the annual report and I discovered you've terminated him. You've sacked him. And you've given him a $2.7 million termination payment. Now, can you just tell us what the true story is? Was he happily retired, great job, at the time of his choosing, end of his contract? Or did you terminate him because he did something wrong and you gave him this big balloon termination payout because that's what his contract said when you forced him out earlier than he wanted to go?
Stephen, did you have two other questions?
If you'd like.
Yeah.
Sure. I think you've changed your policy on the restricted performance shares that are being issued under the old scheme. The executives weren't getting the dividends if they didn't perform, and now they are getting the dividends. So Mr Klein, I think he's great, but he might turn out to be terrible. But he's going to get all the dividends on all these shares that he hasn't paid for and that he may never get. But in the interim, he's getting the dividends. Why is that? That's out of line with best practice in the market. And I think the other criticism is that you haven't released as much information as other comparable companies in terms of the performance hurdles that drive some of the bonus payments. So why have you held back some of that criteria from the shareholders in terms of being able to assess whether the performance hurdles are appropriate?
Yeah, thank you very much. Firstly, regarding Mr Stewart's termination payment, you should read the word termination as synonymous with cessation of employment. There was never any question of termination in the sense you expressed it. When John was persuaded to come out to Australia, the contract that he entered into had a provision for the receipt of 1 year's what we call FAR, fixed annual remuneration, on cessation of employment. And as you say, we persuaded him to stay longer, a few more years, and I think he did a great job, but we were simply meeting the terms of that contract, which is a fairly typical measure, and in fact you'll have observed the federal government's recent legislation limiting termination payments to that 1 year, so it was in line with that. As far as the dividends on shares go, there are a number of ways one can structure securities in a long-term incentive plan. Essentially three main ones: options, shares and what are called rights. Options are, if you like, a piece of paper that says you can buy a share at a future date at this price. We all know what shares are, and rights are like shares, but they aren't actually shares until you receive them eventually on vesting, and so rights don't pay any dividends. In the case of the senior executives, what we do each year is consult with remuneration consultants, take independent advice and say, how should this remuneration be structured, say for a particular person, what size of long-term incentive should you get? And once you take that size of incentive, you can then either do it in options or shares or rights. If you provide that in shares, you get less shares than you would if you provided it in rights, because the shares have dividends coming in through them, and therefore they have a higher intrinsic value, so you get less of them. And so in the end, the executive is in a similar position. in terms of the dividends and the capital value that they receive on vesting. Now, you might say yes, but in the meantime, if they're never going to vest, you still get the dividends. I think it's particularly important to align the executives as much as possible with shareholders, and shareholders have shares, and they understand the benefits of dividends and as well as capital appreciation. One of the problems if you provide rights, for example, is that the normal person would then be a bit antipathetic to paying out high dividends, because he'd say, gosh, that's going to make the share price a little lower when I eventually get them through the rights. And so in terms of alignment, shares are a much better way of doing it, and that's why I always prefer shares to options. But let me assure you that the executives aren't getting a free ride in the sense of dividends compared to if they had rights. It's all taken into account in the valuation. As for your third question, the long-term incentive plans we have are only received, benefits are only received by the executives if we beat the median of other companies. That is, unless in the next 3 years, in particular cases, we beat the median of our peers in returns to shareholders, they don't receive anything. There are two elements. One is on what's called total shareholder return. That's one half of the benefit, and the other half's measured on internal measures like return on equity and cash earnings growth. We don't disclose the hurdles there because doing that would be akin to making forward projections of our profit, which is not something that we do as a listed company. But I can assure you that the board takes its responsibilities very seriously in this regard, and we set ambitious hurdles so that I think, for example, those awarded last year are probably going to have real trouble vesting because the first year's cash earnings and ROE were below budget, and you've got to make that up in the next 2 years. By the way, the benefit of having internal hurdles is that when you expense them through the profit and loss account, if they're never received by the executive, you can reverse it and credit the profit and loss account, whereas with external hurdles like total shareholder return, you expense them but you can never get it back. So I hope that explains our rationale there.